Hey folks, this has been a uniquely difficult video to record and to make articulate. This is, let me just speak. This is prompted by the newsletter that Benabel Wen sent out earlier this week, discussing the racism, inclusion, healing, and diversity panel that we had a week ago today. And, it's no secret that I have a lot of respect for Benabel's work, so I'm not calling anyone out. I am calling everyone in. But I also want to speak to some points that were raised in that newsletter, because I worry that it's the kind of content that might let people, white folks in particular, off the hook. Well, the first thing I have to say is that you should watch that panel discussion if you haven't. Yes, it's a long video. If you can binge watch whatever show is popular on Netflix right now, you can certainly spend a couple hours engaging that. You don't have to do it all in one sitting. In Havana's recent video, which was also a response to this newsletter, she talked about a quote from Desmond Tutu, essentially summing up that to be silent is to choose the side of the oppressor. And so the reason why I want to make this is because it's truth that when we are silent or when we dismiss the dialogue, even if that's not our intent, we do side with the problems rather than engaging with solutions. And there are concrete things that were discussed in that panel, and that we've, as a community, I hate that word more and more every day, but that have been engaged for years. The answers are out there. The steps are out there. It doesn't mean we like them or that they're easy, but just because we don't like them or that they're not easy doesn't mean they're not doable. It just means that we got to get on board with it. Progress is change. Change is uncomfortable. Our bodies are literally meant to stop us from feeling uncomfortable. And yet, change is necessary. So, look at, I really do want you to watch that panel discussion. I really do want to share with you some concrete things that came from that. And I just want to be honest, and I want to tell the truth as I know it. The first concrete thing you can do is you can listen with intention. A lot of folks right now are saying, well, I'm really listening. This is a time for me to listen. This is a time for, people of color to take the stage and to tell us. No, that's been going on for generations. The discussion's been had. The stories are still being told when people are generous enough to share their pain with us, but we ain't listening, folks. We're hearing. And there's a difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is the perception of sound. Listening is the internalization of it. If you're really hearing these stories, if you're really listening to these stories, you can't not be changed by them. You just can't not be. You know what I mean? You just can't not be. So stop hearing and start listening. That's the very first thing. You got to get it out of your head that being passive and silent is the right thing to do. Listening isn't passive. It may be receptive, but it's not passive. You have to actively engage it. You have to internalize it. And then you have to be changed by it. And it hurts. Listening hurts. Because it's going to mean that parts of your self-perception are changed or even blown up. That's tough, right? That sucks to feel that way. Like I said earlier, our bodies are meant to protect us from feeling uncomfortable. Hearing, listening matters. Listening leaves you changed. And that change may be uncomfortable and it may hurt, but it's never going to hurt more than the consequences of racism, racist ideas, racist policies, however you want to talk about it. That discomfort that comes from really listening and internalizing is never going to hurt more than what we're seeing on the news every day. It's just never going to. Listening isn't hearing. Hearing isn't listening. And it's time to listen. That's the first thing you can do. That's the first thing we can do. You know, I tend to use the editorial you. That makes it seem like I know better. I don't. So just like know that, okay? The second thing is that our language matters, the words we choose matters, and that what we say often has subtext. And subtext isn't always intentional. Sometimes it is. But there is a history in this country of language that is coded, but that is meant to ignite unconscious bias. These are called dog whistles, if you haven't heard that term before. And the reason they're called that is because, you know, only dogs can hear a dog whistle. Well, only the unconscious biases in us can hear the dog whistle language. The most famous example of this, I would say, is probably Reagan's welfare queen. When Reagan said that term, everyone in the United States knew who he was talking about immediately. Doesn't matter how liberal or conservative anyone was. Doesn't even matter probably what race you were. Everyone knew who Reagan was talking about because of the lived experience of bias against poor women of color that has become center to American thinking. When a person of color, when a black woman, for example, shares an experience with passion, with hurt, with emotion, they'll frequently, you know, I mean, there's a history of being called, you know, the angry black woman, for example. That's a dog whistle. And so when we are talking about these things, when we make the choice to speak about these things, we have to comb through our language and edit out any of those dog whistles, which means we have to learn what they are. And that's the other part of it. Like, it's just a thing that has to happen. Because even if you are doing it unintentionally, it's still a dog whistle. You know, it's still igniting anger and fear and hurt and bias. It's just still happening. And it's not, this is like, people are going to say, well, you know, freedom of speech. No. People think freedom of speech means they can say whatever they want without consequences. It just means you can say whatever you want, you know? It doesn't mean there aren't consequences to our choices, to our words. Freedom of speech doesn't mean you don't face consequences. It means you shouldn't be arrested for it, but it does mean you might get called out. It does mean you might get shamed. It does mean you might incriminate yourself, whatever the case is. You know what I mean? Freedom of speech is not, I can do or say whatever I want without consequence. It just means you can say whatever you want without getting arrested, or it does for the time being anyway. You have to watch the subtext, even if you don't mean to say something biased, and we do it all the time. And here's another thing. I did a whole video on language. So much of modern language is tied to bias and tied to racism, you know, like anyway, I made my point. The third thing is that we need to learn the unique reality of American anti-blackness. So we tend to generalize things into racist, into like terms of like racism, right? And I do that all the time. But there is a unique racism in the United States. It's a specifically anti-black racism in the United States that is generations old, and in fact woven into this country from its earliest days. And you can't really understand how to engage in this dialogue until you understand how pervasive that is and how specific it is to the United States. Now, that's not to say that other racism is better or, you know, less painful, or that racism around the world is less insidious. That's not the point. The point is, though, there's a specific kind of anti-blackness in the United States. And the best way to understand that is Ibram X. Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. It's a big book. It's easy to read. I'm still reading it because I always have 10 or 15 books going at any time. But you get, like, by the first third of the book, you understand American history in a way that you haven't before. And it's going to make you understand why the conversations tend to go the way they do. The fourth thing is to work with and engage creations by people of color, indigenous people, LGBTQIA plus people, disabled people. I was listening to Larissa in the panel, and she talked about how when she was a kid, she liked mystery novels, and if you wanted to read mystery novels, you were going to be reading white people stories. She didn't say it that way, but they were all written by and about white people. Most groups in this country grow up reading straight white romance stories. Every Disney movie, up until recently. It's like whiteness is so centered. And we don't think twice about it, but anyone who grew up queer until recently probably did not read a queer love story until they were an adult or a teen. Anyone who was black was probably surrounded by white stories. Not probably, was. And the same, it goes across the board. And so I for years would back decks or books on Kickstarter so that I could share them on the channel or, share them on Instagram. And then I would put them away and say, okay, that's not for me because it's disrespectful for me to sort of colonize this work. And it may be, there may be some element of that, but it's so stupid for me to have thought that way. And maybe that's judgmental. I don't know. But only I think in working with the stories and working with authentic experience of people do we start to understand the world and people more clearly. And so it's we white people have no problem that generations of people of color grow up with Little Mermaid and Beauty and the Beast and Snow White and Sleeping Beauty and all of the white stories that kids watch, but we never have to have to isn't the right word, but we're never exposed to anything else. So it reinforces the centering of whiteness as the default. And then what we do get is often stereotyped because it's through white gaze. It's people of color's lives told through white gaze. I for example, I've been reading about Afro-Caribbean spirituality and religions because I've always been fascinated by religion and spirituality as an anthropology topic, right? But also for understanding how the world got the way it did. And I was looking for a book about spirituality, Vodou in particular, in Haiti. I could not find a single book that wasn't written by a white person. The one I settled on was ultimately written by a white person who managed to bring up the topics that we're kind of talking about in this community now too. So that gave me enough confidence that this person has at least thought about those things. But it's not lived Haitian experience. It's written by a white person who went to Haiti to do it, and that's not the same thing. So, to really understand and to really experience as much as possible, engaging the work of people who aren't us isn't disrespectful. It's disrespectful to say, oh, well, that's not for me. Because then the other thing that does too is it contributes to that sort of romanticizing communities that have been marginalized. The way that we do in the United States today of Native Americans, oh, they really, they were so in touch with the earth and, they really just knew, they got it, and yeah, maybe, but they were also human beings living lives. There were plenty of Native Americans that owned slaves, you know what I mean? There was war, there was peace, there was magic, there was drama. The point is humanity, it was the thing, but we romanticize it, and we do that with so many other cultures today. That's not new, but anyway, the point is we're talking about human beings and human lived experience, and to truly understand human lived experience, it's probably a good idea to engage the work created by those humans, you know? The fifth thing is if you have a seat at the table, whatever that table is, you got to use it. We have to stop being afraid of the systems of power that make us think that we won't ever be successful, or we won't ever, you know. I've been struggling with this for months, because a lot of this has coincided with me working on my book, and I'm like, I'm never going to get a book deal. Like, first of all, if a publisher doesn't publish my book because I've demanded in 1 or 2 emails or Instagram posts that they do a better job representing them, that's not a business that I should be working with. Second of all, what the fuck? Why is it wrong to say, hey, look, let's go back to that example of the Haitian voodoo book, right? I could not find one written by a person of color from Haiti, by a black Haitian. So I settled on a white person, a book written by a white person. Now, publishers will say, hey, we publish what we get submitted, and people of color aren't submitting these things. I don't know if that's true or not, and that comes to the next point, which we'll get to. But what I do know is that if a white person comes along with their Haitian voodoo book and says, I've written this and I have this experience, the publisher could say, this is a good idea, it's not for us. Let's go find someone who can actually speak to this from their lived experience. Or, barring that, okay, great, we're going to bring on a collaborator for you. But yeah, I mean, yeah. Sorry, these are such complicated ideas. But they're not. I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, it's not all that complicated. Just like let's get it together. Let's use our seat at the table, if we have one, to say, this is what needs to happen. And if you don't have a seat at the table, you can ask for one. That's harder to do, right? But I just, we've got to, if we've got to, anyone who reaches the level of privilege where they become part of the system, can say to the system, hey, let's try some new stuff. And if they're punished for it, then that, I don't know, that's when like discrimination lawsuits come up, I guess. The sixth one is ask for receipts. So during the conversation, we talked a lot about how the industry will say, well, there isn't really a market for this. Okay, I mean, maybe there isn't. I don't know. I feel like it's a conversation that's been happening long enough that there is, but I'm not in that field. So, why not say, okay, great, can you show me the data that supports that? Let's just see it. Let's just look at it. You know what I mean? And is there another business model that can be used to encourage a market in this? I mean, it's like but ultimately what I mean is like, we give benefit of the doubt all the time to the people who are saying no, and that can't happen. And that's just because that's what they're used to saying, But if we don't give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe there's an opportunity to change perceptions there too. So, yeah. The seventh thing is not to let you or anyone else off the hook. Like, this isn't work that gets finished. It's not easy. It sucks. It hurts. Change is awful and gross and icky, and like we've talked about before, it's a thing that our bodies are built to protect us from. At the same time, we just gotta do it. Like, we just gotta do it. There's no other way. We just gotta do it. So like, don't let yourself off the hook. Don't let anyone else off the hook. Just like, let's do it. Let's do the right thing. Like, let's just be the humans that we wish we were. You know what I mean? Like, let's just do the fucking thing. We talked on the panel about, and this goes back to asking for receipts and using your seat at the table. Like, you speak with your wallet. Money talks. That's, I do believe in consumer activism because this is capitalism. That's the bottom line. Money talks. The Supreme Court has said that corporations are people. When which has centered money over people, but people have money, you know, and we can use our money wisely. You know, the ninth thing is create with intent. And this has come up a lot too. It's like, you know, how do I know I'm doing it wrong? What if I try to do it right and someone tells me I'm wrong? You know, if I'm a deck creator or I'm a book writer or whatever, content creator on YouTube, what if I say the wrong thing? What if I make this art and someone tells me it's offensive, you know? Well, I think the first step is to create with intent, so you try to avoid fucking up that way. But if you do, like, so what? You know what I mean? Like, okay, great. Thank you for that feedback. Now let me try to internalize it and work with it. You know, we're so afraid of getting called out and fucking up and making a mistake, as though being called out is like the most painful thing that can happen to us. It's not. Like, I get called out frequently, and have been. And yeah, I mean, I'm known for being an asshole to trolls, but like, when someone will engage me in, you know, in I was gonna say in a respectful way, that sounds like tone policey. When someone engages me on something that I've done that's problematic, I've got to sit with it, you know what I mean? It still doesn't hurt anywhere near as much as the consequences of racism and the erasure of other people in the world, and the centering of white supremacy. Like, it just is never going to hurt that much. So so you fucked up. So you said the wrong thing. So you drew a picture that got it wrong. And someone was generous enough to share with you feedback. And if they were generous enough to share the feedback with you, it's possible that they'll be generous enough to help you, you know, correct the ill, you know, figure out how you can make the picture more accurate, the book more accurate, whatever. You know, like, if your feedback, we always say feedback is a gift, but we're so terrified of it. You know, like, so what if we screw up? You know, which is one, you know, I don't think art should be created by committee. I don't think that there should be like, you know, like a review board of, you know, the chosen who says yes, you know, or no. But I do think that, you know, as a, you know, I'll just speak from experience as a playwright, you know, when I work on a new piece, you know, and you don't just write a play and it gets produced. In fact, you know, most plays never get produced. What you wind up with is a development cycle. And so you take your work and you put it out in front of an audience for a reading. And then that audience tells you everything they hate about your play. And you go through that over and over again. Most of my grad school experience was that, you know, I would write a play, we would do a reading, and everyone would say, I think you should change this. I don't like that. You do build a thick skin going through that, but that's how you make it better. And it doesn't mean that every piece of feedback is valuable. It just means that you're subjecting yourself to critique, you know, to feedback from people who understand what you're trying to make. And so artists who really want to get it right as a tarot creator, there's no reason not to do that. You know what I mean? To submit yourself for critique by people who know what they're talking about, you know, and then taking that feedback and working with it. Some feedback will be not helpful. Some feedback will be mean. Some feedback will be useful. Some feedback will not make sense to you. Some feedback will show you that you are off track. Some will show you that the person who's giving the feedback doesn't understand what you're doing. But again, none of that is as bad as getting piled up on or experiencing the consequences of being erased. You know what I mean? So, like, yes, it sucks. And you're still going to live at the end of the day. You know, I mean, yes, I have sat in chairs and felt like garbage about my writing while an audience of people takes what I worked on with all my heart and pisses all over it. But I'm still here and I kept doing it and I still write, you know? So it's going to be okay if we submit ourselves for critique, and the work that we made. And that's another thing too. We are not our work. You know, we are not what we make, even though sometimes it feels like we are. The final thing is I wrote, you know, in the title cards, don't tokenize. Tokenizing is bad. But what I mean in this case is, like, when you get feedback, you got to remember that people, like, no one speaks for their entire community, you know? And so you got to, like, first of all, diversify your review board, your critique panel, if you submit to that idea, and recognize that, like, one opinion isn't the be all and end all. You know what I mean? And when you allow one person to represent an entire community, you're tokenizing them. You're also erasing the community, you know? So, we tend to talk about tokenization in terms of art, where, like, you have one or two people of color in a tarot deck, but also in terms of, like, your response to, well, that person said it was okay, you know? Okay, well, this person's saying it's not, so how do you reconcile that? Maybe you need to get a bigger panel to review what you're doing, you know? And then ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to own what you've made, you know? That's it. That's, you know, that's how it is. So look, typically, well, actually, it's not as long. I've tried to make this video several times and gone off track because it's, you know, it's like I have so much in my brain that I want to get out. Again, this is a call in, but these are concrete things that are doable. Listen with intention. Watch what we're saying, our subtext. Consider those dog whistles and erase them from our language. Learn the unique reality of American anti-blackness in particular. Engage creations by Black, queer, Indigenous, Latinx, disabled people, so that the view that you have is not centered on whiteness and white gaze, but comes from the lived experience of folks who aren't you, who aren't us, who whatever. If you have a seat at the table, use it. And if you don't have a seat at the table, demand one. You know, what's to say that you don't deserve a seat at the table just because they haven't been, you know? Like, we wait for the cool kids to invite us to sit with them at lunch. Fucking put your tray down. When you're told there's no market, or when you're told, like, an excuse for why things can't be better, ask for receipts. You know, show me the money, show me the data. Why not? Why not? Don't let yourself or anyone else off the hook. Speak with your wallet, create with intent, and don't tokenize. Like, those are concrete, doable things right now that came up in that video. Change, you know, doesn't happen overnight, and it's hard. I mean, I came back to that several times in this video. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, look, it's we're gonna get it wrong sometimes. We're not perfect. We're humans, but we can do the things. You know, we can do them. And again, like, though they are awkward or uncomfortable or difficult or whatever, they are still not as bad as being erased. That to me is, like, all there is to it. You know? Like, it's still nowhere near as bad as being erased. It's nowhere near as bad as suffering the consequences of racism. You know, and I'm speaking particularly about American racism, but around the world. You know, we can... There are things to do. And there are more things to do that you can pull out of that video, but you have to listen to them. So that's why that's the first thing. Anyway, you know, look, I rambled and stuff. Yeah, so I guess I'm going to stop here. And as always, you know, I hope that this is informative, and I hope it's helpful, and I just hope, you know, I hope that the listening does happen, because once you listen, you really are changed. So that's what I have to say about that. Take care, stay healthy, think of others, be human, think of humanity, and just, you know, keep trying. Take care.